the NIH Active 6 trial,
Mm-hmm.
where they had to do something which is considered a never event, which is changing the primary outcome in the middle of the trial. And they changed it, right? They were looking at a difference in illness, I think symptom severity at day 14. That was the original protocol, which makes sense for a viral illness. You want to see who gets better by day 14. And in the middle of the trial, without providing any data for why they did it, they switch it to, no, we want to compare how people are feeling at day 28. And in the actual paper, you see that at day 14, there's a profoundly statistically significant difference in favor of ivermectin. So if you're a trialist there and you're, pharma's running these agencies in these trials, suddenly your researchers are telling you, Houston, we got a problem here. We have a profoundly statistically significant benefit that we've identified at day 14. What are we going to do? The answer? Let's change the endpoint to day 28, where that's statistically significant. By the way, it's still beneficial there. It just wasn't statistically significant.
Yeah. It wasn't statistically significant, which somehow, because the press is undereducated with respect to science, journalists will translate into no effect, which is absolutely and completely unjustified interpretation. But, I have been persuaded by my own scientific journey that the philosophy of science matters tremendously, and almost nobody is educated in it because it's boring and seems like a different field and all of that. And this is a case where the alteration, the moving of the goalposts in the middle of the study it renders the entire exercise completely scientifically invalid.
Invalid. Bret, if I did that in a trial, let's say I did a study, imagine the speed of the rejection from the journal when I actually submit my paper and they see that I changed my endpoint, moved the goalpost in the middle of conducting a study. They would say, I'm sorry, we can't publish this. You've committed a scientific, a trial wrong. Like these invalidate. I'm sorry, Dr. Kory, this invalidates whatever you found. So
at the level of evidence, it invalidates it. At the level of behavior, it's fraud.
Yep.
Right?
Fraud.
You are the thing that makes science work is the directionality of the observation, right? You have a pattern, you observe it, you hypothesize a possible explanation, you formulate a test based on the predictions, and then you run the test. It has to go in that order, or there's no science in it. If you knowingly take the prediction and you modify it to match the data, you have taken something that is anti-scientific and you have dressed it as if it was science, which is not only is there no information in your study because we don't know where else you did that, but the intent evident in your modifying, you're moving the goalposts mid-study is to deceive, to lead people to believe that the evidence says one thing rather than what it actually said, right? You are required, even if you think your study found sampling error, right? To the extent that you are interested in publishing this study, you have to publish what it actually found relative to the actual predictions, which in this case come in the form of this particular measure that was then altered mid-study.
100%.
So it's fraud.
You described the scientific method, right? And you talked about then tested. And here there's some rules on how you test things, right? You come up with a study design and you say, I'm going to compare these two things in this way. And that's what you got to stick to, right? But here I want to go a little further, right? So you called it out. First of all, it's anti-science. It invalidates the study. I like how you called out the behavior is fraud, right? The act is anti-science and invalidating. The behavior is fraud. But let's go further there. That study sailed to publication in the Journal of the American Medical Association, which is literally, I think it's number 2 or number 3 on the highest impact medical journals in the world. Published that study. where they changed the endpoint in the middle. I mean, and there was really very little mention of it. It's not even a limitation. And of course, no one talks about it in the media. No one's like, "Oh, JAMA just published a study, but they moved the goalpost in the middle." And what's even more crazy, right? And I'm sure you've seen the table, right? Because Alex Marino did such good work on dissecting these trials. I mean, his work is unparalleled in the stuff that he's done. And he's not even a physician. I mean, he's a polymath. He's brilliant. But I would the comprehensiveness and detail of the work that he did. I mean, I learned a lot about. I learned way more shenanigans in these trials than even I could pick up. Yep. I learned Alex, right? But Alex, highlighted the table that's published in the actual. So it's so brazen, where they show the difference at day 7, day 14, and day 28, and you can see the statistical significance. You see that it was highly statistically significant at day 7, day 14, and then whoops, just falls under statistical significance at day 28. So it's screaming from the paper in the Journal of American Medical Association. There's no discussion of it. And so that to me would be like Exhibit A in a courtroom of evidence that pharma runs these journals.
100%. And I would just point out, like, let's say, all right, you've recovered from COVID and you go to the doctor and the doctor says, all right, let's get you vaccinated. Right. So let's suppose you know what it means that you've recovered from COVID and you realize, hey, doc, how much do you know about the safety of these novel vaccines? And what happened to natural immunity? We know that that's the best immunity. What's more, if I look at these vaccines, there's no way it could possibly compete because the antigenic choice is so narrow and the antigen is of a variant that's no longer circulating. So you hear, okay, your doctor is advising you to get a shot that can't possibly be safe and cannot possibly compete with the immunity that you've already got. And the same doctor is telling you, yeah, if you get COVID or you're exposed to somebody who has it, ivermectin doesn't work. At the point that you discover that your doctor is in some way downstream of some distortion that has caused them not to look out for your best interests with respect to these so-called vaccines, at the point you know that they're needlessly exposing you to the risks of a novel therapy, when that same doctor tells you that actually repurposed drugs are not effective, then you should wonder whether the very same distorting influence has caused them to miscall that one as well. And what I see almost across the board is people assuming that the embarrassing revelations surrounding the so-called vaccine campaign are the limit of what happened. And for some reason, the sophisticated position is, yes, but ivermectin didn't work, which is obviously nonsense.
Yeah, like that was the ceiling of the corruption and fraud, was the vaccines, right? And they don't see how much further and deeper it went, right?
And I don't think they understand. Well, I mean, this is really the core issue.
Yeah.
They do not understand what the pandemic would have looked like if we had played differently with respect to repurposed drugs and vitamin D, right? If we had applied those things, what would it, look through pharma's eyes.
Yeah.
At the level of how profitable this would have been, it was spectacularly profitable as it went down. How profitable would it have been if we went on a campaign to correct people's vitamin D deficiencies and had applied ivermectin as a prophylactic when people were exposed to COVID and then treated them with ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine if they came down with COVID? What would the pandemic have looked like?
I feel like I want to raise my hand and be like, call on me. I want to answer that.
All right. You Doug. Sorry.
I mean, Bret, we know the answer, right? It would have obliterated those massive marketplaces that opened up with this pandemic. I mean, overnight, you had a marketplace in north of $100 billion, right, for the pricey patented pharmaceuticals and the vaccines. I mean, first of all, it obliterated that market. That's one thing. That was what they were trying to avoid. But we know it would have changed the face of the pandemic. I mean, we've seen it in places that use repurposed drugs. I mean, it was that you didn't have hospitals filling. You would have had very few hospitalizations, very few deaths, very little morbidity. It would have changed the entire experience of this pandemic, and it would have saved millions of lives.